Good afternoon, and welcome to the third School of Theology and Ministry Anniversary Lecture and the inaugural address of the school's second dean. I'm Pat DeLue. I'm Vice Provost for Faculties at Boston College. In the national fiscal crisis of 2008, Boston College, along with institutions of higher education from across the country, took a careful look at its use of resources, an effort at good stewardship that, of course, continues today. But in that year of 2008, Boston College did something else as well, something that few universities would have undertaken. As a sign of its fiscal health and good management, and as a sign of its optimism for the future, Boston College founded a new school. And it is a school through which our university lives its Catholic identity, a school dedicated to excellence in theological scholarship, and to the education of lay and ordained ministers who will serve the Church. We are here today to celebrate that school and to welcome its new dean. I'm happy to introduce to you our president, Father William P. Leahy of the Society of Jesus, who will in turn introduce to you Mark Massa. Father.
I have the honor of welcoming you to this afternoon's lecture, and I also want to express my appreciation to all of you for your attendance. As Pat DeLue indicated, the School of Theology and Ministry is the result of a reaffiliation decision made by Weston Jesuit School of Theology, Boston College, and the Jesuit Conference. And the founding purpose of this school is to continue the work not only of Weston Jesuit, which traces its roots back to 1927, but also the Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry, which was established at Boston College in 1971. Those two units, Weston Jesuit and the Institute of Religious Ed and Pastoral Ministry, form the two departments of the School of Theology and Ministry. And we're gathered here today to hear remarks on American Catholicism by the second dean of the School of Theology and Ministry. That person, Father Mark Massa, is a native of Ohio and holds an undergraduate degree in theology and history from the University of Detroit Mercy. He entered the Society of Jesus in 1968, and during his years prior to ordination, he also studied for a master's in history at the University of Chicago. He obtained a master's in divinity from Weston, and then eventually a doctoral degree in church history from Harvard. Before coming to Boston College this past summer to become dean, he served as the holder of the Ronner Chair at Fordham University and also as the director of the Curran Center there. The focus of his teaching and writing has been the Catholic experience in the United States since World War II. He is the author of 7 books and numerous articles. The latest of his books is entitled The American Catholic Revolution, which examines the Catholic community in the United States after Vatican II. So please join me in welcoming Father Mark Massa, Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry. Mark.
Good afternoon. Thank all of you for coming out this afternoon. As a scholar of American Catholic history, culture, and belief, I make it my rule to always talk about the American Catholic past in discrete, easily compartmentalized units. And part of my wariness for doing that is based on the oldest joke of the theology department at Fordham, where I was for the past 23 years. And the joke at Fordham goes something like this: what you have when you cross Tony Soprano and a scholar of American Catholic studies? And the answer, of course, is someone who makes you an offer you can't understand. I would like to make you an offer that you can understand this afternoon. So I'm going to break my rule and do some big stuff in contextualizing American Catholicism within a much broader frame of history. Thus, there are three things that I want to do this afternoon. That's my overt agenda anyways. My hidden agenda is to arrive at the end of our time together having achieved what the Benedictines describe as the goal of a Jesuit liturgy, which is that everyone emerges with their dignity intact and no one gets hurt, okay? So my three goals this afternoon first are, I want to explain why the American Catholic community underwent a dramatic and indeed I would say traumatic change in the course of the 1960s, largely as a result of its engagement with history. Secondly, I want to pose some possible reasons to you about why this engagement with history was important for us here today. And thirdly, I want to explain why all of this is important for the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. At the end of these remarks, there will be question and answer from the audience, which in my experience is always the most interesting part of things. So I encourage you to sort of ask hard questions. I'll do my darndest to answer them. My first point, why American Catholics in the 1960s underwent a dramatic engagement with history. Most Catholics before the Second Vatican Council took for granted that what they did on Sunday mornings looked pretty much like what the Church had always done. The sacred, if sometimes misunderstood, drama of the Mass was understood as a timeless event, like the words in saecula saeculorum, literally for ages and ages, usually translated into English as forever and ever, that ended all the prayers that were said by the priest. In the pre-Vatican II Mass, the drone of Latin was punctuated by the sudden appearance of Greek, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, witnessing to the earliest days of the Christian community outside Jerusalem in the far-flung Greek Empire. The Greek-speaking Roman Empire. Ancient titles applied to the Bishop of Rome, like Summus Pontificus, pontifex, of course, being the Latin word applied to the high priest of the Roman imperial cult, overseeing sacrifices to the gods. Those kinds of words were mixed with an ancient familiarity of address that hearkened back to the less formal worship of the house churches of the first and second centuries, a familiarity we still see today in the liturgy of the Roman Rite, when we say, in union with Benedict, our Pope, and Timothy, our Bishop. All of these lent credibility to the belief that the Mass of the Roman Rite was a ritual not only of ancient provenance, but something outside of time altogether. The problem, as my book opens anyway, the problem is that Catholics arriving for Mass on the first Sunday of Advent in 1964, the date which was mandated for implementing the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council, these Catholics found their familiar parish church to be, in the words of author Gary Wills, a strange house littered with signs of alien occupancy. Century-old taboos and childhood memories of nuns' injunctions were suddenly, and for some traumatically, overturned. Catholics were now asked to do things against which elaborate inhibitions had been built up all of their lives. A significant part of the older Mass celebrated between Trent and Vatican II had taken the form of a sacred dance focused on the host, the sacred wafer, which in Catholic theology is Jesus. Generations of Catholic school children, and I was certainly one, were told never to touch the host, even if it fell out of your mouth. All of that now seemed banished by the reforms that began to be implemented on that Sunday in 1964. The intensely focused quiet of the Tridentine Mass soon came to be replaced by the sound of guitars, the sudden appearance of banners, and the disappearance of statues at side altars, and the talk of the bread of celebration that left a number of Catholics reeling between confusion and feelings of betrayal. One disgruntled parishioner complained that his parish had a fellow who stood in front of the church, and this fellow, and I quote from a diocesan newspaper here, he tells us when to stand and when to sit and when to kneel. It made me so mad that I couldn't think of anything else. I found another parish where they didn't have an interlocutor saying, "Gentlemen, be seated." Perhaps most dramatically, and certainly first in the order of new things noticed when entering the church on the first Sunday of Advent in 1964, was the fact that the altar, which formed the locus of attention, was now pulled away for the back wall, so that the priest would face the congregation rather than standing with his back to the faithful. A simple liturgical move that, while restoring the liturgical practice of the 20th century to the early church, overturned a style of worship that had been practiced in the Western Church for 1,000 years. Who, many Catholics would soon ask, was being addressed in this rite, and on whose side was the priest, representing the congregation before God, or standing in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, for the gathered people? Moreover, the new placement of the altar facing the people also meant that priests had to clean up their act liturgically, as now the entire congregation, and not only altar boys, and presumably God, could detect goof-ups in the choreography of the celebration. Among other things, this dealt a death blow to generations of altar boy stories, a revered Catholic form of urban legend. The reforms in the celebration of the Eucharist, of course, represented just one of the many changes that Catholics had to deal with during the course of what is now called the long 60s. But it represented an especially neuralgic change because for the first time in their memory, rank and file Catholics, everyone, could now address how relevant their worship should be. For the first time in the lives of many adult Catholics, questions of what the Eucharist meant in terms of their secular lives were presented as real, live issues that could be debated at print and in parish council meetings. The forces of modernity, so long held at bay outside the fortress of the Church, now pounded at the door and demanded attention. Quite suddenly, Catholics came to utilize new prefixes in describing each other. Liberal Catholics and conservative Catholics, progressive Catholics and traditionalist Catholics. These all now appeared before the noun Catholic to describe how people stood on the liturgical reforms. Such prefixes were largely unknown when I was growing up. I was 14 in 1964, and when I was growing up, there were only two kinds of Catholics, Catholics and lapsed Catholics. Whole forests, of course, have been decimated to provide pages for books, accounting for the sometimes fractious debates over the liturgy that emerged after 1964. Some of these accounts have situated the new liturgy as emerging seamlessly from liturgical reforms set in motion at the beginning of the 20th century by Pope Pius X and Pope Pius XI. Others have argued that it emerged from Pius Parsch in Austria, from the Benedictine Dom Virgil Michel at St. John's Abbey in Minnesota during the 1920s, or from Monsignor Martin Hellriegel's liturgically correct church in St. Louis, Missouri during the 1940s and 50s. Others have critiqued those liturgical reforms as hasty and ill thought out responses to the perceived but largely overstated threats of modernization and secularization in Western Europe and North America. Still others, and I think Jesuit historian John O'Malley has done this most convincingly, have argued that the liturgical reforms represented a fragile truce between two groups of church leaders who had very different understandings of change in the church. One of these groups looked to the past to find the pure models for reform, while others looked to the future. But as O'Malley argues so brilliantly in his book, What Happened at Vatican II, whatever the intentions of either group, their fragile truce ended with unintended consequences. And O'Malley presses this idea. He calls it the law of unintended consequences. Through the lens of O'Malley's law of unintended consequences, events in history are only partly defined by the intentions of the actors who start them. That is, whatever the intentions of the people gathered at the Second Vatican Council, the reforms mandated by the Council took on a life of their own once they began to be implemented. Understood thus, the battles within the American Catholic Church, set off by changing the liturgy beginning on the first Sunday of Advent in 1964, finally were less about theology or worship than about history itself. Those battles, and many of the battles since, between so-called liberals and conservatives in the church, can better be understood, I think, as being about change itself. It's more about change than the arrangement of church furniture or the language in which prayers should be addressed to God. Catholic commentator Gary Wills recognized the central role of change in history in what Vatican II let loose in his book published in 1971, which was called Bare Ruined Choirs. And here's what Gary Wills had to say about it, and I quote him directly here. The reform of the liturgy mandated by Vatican II let out the dirty little secret in the most startlingly symbolic way, the fact that the church changes. No more neat ahistorical belief that what one did on Sunday mornings looked, with minor adjustments, just what the church had always done from the time of the catacombs. In the past, D.H. Lawrence claimed that our civilization's dirty little secret was sex. But the church's secret, hidden away, minimalized when it could not be ignored, was change itself. Other things came and went, captive to history, but the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. And the gates of hell often look like history or the latest products of history: modernism, science, rationalism. We did not deal with such fads. What was sound in them, the church had always possessed. Thus, the experience of change came to American Catholics as a form of personal crisis. Thus far Wills. What the Sacred Constitution on the liturgy did then was sponsor an awareness, an historical awareness, if you will, that the liturgy, no less than the texts of the Bible, evolved over time and bear the marks of that historical evolution. The very idea that some in the pre-Vatican II Church had struggled so strenuously to eradicate from Catholic consciousness, that is, that no symbol or ritual comes from Jesus or the disciples in its perfect, complete, and final form, ready for contemporary use. That very idea was now being advanced by an ecumenical council of the Universal Church. Like the opening of the windows to let in the streaming light into Miss Havisham's house in Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, an opening which instantaneously destroyed the timeless, death-defying world of her jilted wedding day decades before. All of that former secure, if frozen world was now gone. Things change. If the debates within the American Catholic community set off by the decrees of Vatican II are rooted in the unintended consequences of allowing, or even encouraging, the Catholic faithful to see their centuries-old faith through the lens of historical mindedness, and I think they were that, then those battles suddenly become more important, and the stakes become higher. What if, as appeared to be the case in light of the new awareness of change and development within the Church unleashed by Vatican II, what if ruptures appeared to define the development of the tradition in tandem with continuity? What if the efforts of theological progressives to reconcile Catholicism with the scientific and historical insights of modern culture actually represented the side of the angels? What if the institutional structures of the Church were subject to perpetual evolution, as Cardinal Newman argued almost a century before Vatican II. My second point, why was this engagement with history coming out of the 1960s important for us today? The implications of letting historical consciousness out of the bag spread considerably beyond liturgy, and the effects of that consciousness continued far beyond the 1960s. Theological arguments offered in the language of natural law, the form in which the Western Church had argued some of its most important teachings on sexuality, money, and war, for instance, were now seen as problematic by many American Catholic theologians, precisely because of natural law's unchanging presuppositions about human nature and social reality. And especially the question of women in the Church came to be seen by many Catholics as embodying often embarrassing presuppositions of cultural worlds now gone forever, and not categories dropped from heaven. Others viewed even the questioning of those things as doubts propagated by the devil. From our vantage point today, in a new millennium, the efforts of both theological progressives who sought to explore the ramifications of the reforms of the Council, and of the theological traditionalists who sought to claim Vatican II completely for the side of continuity and timeless truth, embody issues of considerably more importance than the arrangement of church furniture, the creation of parish councils, or even questions of married priests. My own sense is that the person who most clearly recognized the stakes involved in the battles unleashed by Vatican II was Canadian Jesuit Bernard Lonergan. In a very brief paper delivered at a seminar sponsored by the Canon Law Society of North America in 1967, Lonergan sketched with breathtaking clarity two worldviews that were just beginning to develop. Lonergan's 8-page paper delivered at that 1967 conference, and the paper's title was The Transition from a Classicist to a Historical Mindedness, I think stands as a roadmap for us for understanding the battles then going on in the second half of the 20th century, as well as the battles still going on within the North American Catholic community today. Lonergan argued that beneath the liturgical and theological battles then being fought in the U.S. Church, there were two quite distinct worldviews. Total mentalities is the phrase that Lonergan used. Two total mentalities that actually determined the specific positions being taken. And I'm going to quote Lonergan here. One mentality may be named classicist, conservative, traditional. The other may be named modern, liberal, or perhaps historicist. The differences between the two are enormous, for they differ in their apprehension of human beings, in their account of the good, and in the role they ascribe to the Church in the world. Thus far, Lonergan. Lonergan observed that for the classicists, the first group, reality consisted of unchanging human values and truths that remained largely unchanged throughout history. For classicist believers, categories like human nature and right action were static, resting on eternal law whose author was God, whose purposes and intentions for humankind could be discovered through the study of an unchanging natural law. But to term this approach to reality as theologically conservative is actually to misname it and probably to misunderstand it, because this stance is actually pre-theological. It is a view held by believers long before theological questions ever come up. But that being said, believers holding this worldview would not look kindly on the call for theological change or development, since, from their point of view, the important things were already embodied in an eternal law, which could not change, since its author was the unchanging God. But laying out these two mentalities with breathtaking clarity and brevity, Lonergan then declared, almost as an aside, what might be taken as the death knell for the uncontested dominance of the thousand-year-old dominance of the classicist approach to Catholic thought and practice. And this is what Lonergan said near the end of his paper. But the static understanding of reality is no longer the only conception, or even the commonly received conception. And I think our scripture scholars would agree that its abstractness and the omissions due to its abstractness have no foundation in the revealed Word of God. End quote. The second approach to reality, which Lonergan labeled historical mindedness, had already won the day in the public culture of Western civilization since the 18th century, so much so that to be modern meant understanding that human culture in almost all of its forms, including religion, developed and evolved over time. Thus, Lonergan observed that it came as no surprise to educated believers that the Bible had evolved over thousands of years, bearing the marks of that evolution in the text itself. And thus, he said, for educated believers in the 20th century, it came as no scandal at all to find out that there were two accounts of the creation of the world, one in the first chapter of Genesis, one in the second chapter of Genesis, having very little in common, just as there were two accounts of what happened at the Red Sea in the book of Exodus, accounts written centuries apart and not by a common author, and certainly not by Moses, even though Jesus himself had referred to those books as the books of Moses. According to Lonergan, then, the cat of historical consciousness had been let out of the bag by the reforms of Vatican II, and there was no going back. As Lonergan saw it then, the real issue underlying the debates in the decades after Vatican II had little to do with worship, church structure, or episcopal authority. The real issue had to do with how the gospel should be understood and proclaimed in a sea of history that was now understood to touch and shape everything. In light of the historical consciousness quite unintentionally freed within the Church by Vatican II, as it was now commonly recognized within the American Catholic community, the question became, how should the Church preach its gospel and celebrate its sacraments and organize itself if there was no fixed, static, and immutable way of doing these things? What if the way of doing these things had to take into account the shifting, developing, and problematic mistakes made in history that are also capable of redemption, thanks to the grace of God? However shocking, then, it might have been to bishops sitting in the vast nave of St. Peter's Basilica who voted for the reforms, historical consciousness and the critical methods that applied them were set loose within the Church. Ecumenical councils, by their very nature, deal with the big stuff on the plate of the world's largest religion. The very vibrancy and size of Catholicism made dealing with the fact of historical change necessary, and in fact, long overdue. Indeed, the Council's own stated intent of, quote, returning to the sources, end quote, made the emergence of historical consciousness not only possible, but probably unavoidable. What canon lawyers, liturgical scholars, and theologians found in precisely going back to the original sources was that things had indeed changed. The Council's directive to return to those sources made it highly likely that Cardinal Newman's famous observation would come to be widely understood within the Church. And Cardinal Newman's famous observation, elucidated, of course, in his great essay on the development of Christian doctrine, was simply this, and I quote Newman, "To live is to change, and to live long is to have changed often." Such a realization contained within it the seeds of a revolution whose growth would be made all the more dramatic by being pent up for so long. Such is the result of the law of unintended consequences, which makes living in history so exciting and so unnerving. Newman's famous insight that to live is to change and to live long is to change often sets the agenda even today for the American Catholic community. And that historical awareness is why the events of the 1960s are still with us today. I will not belabor the obvious traumas of the sex abuse crisis within our community, especially here in Boston, but it does seem to me that part of the lessons of that crisis is that things have changed, that the older cultural deference that allowed the church to hide such goings-on, as well as the older model of the church that expected the laity to simply pay, pray, and obey, and not get involved in telling the church what to do with its renegade clergy, was now gone, hopefully gone forever. But in an even more important sense, the engagement with history that comes out of the 60s is still vitally important for American Catholics today, because Vatican II wrote a check to the laity that has yet to be fully cashed. Vatican II has been rightly described as the council of the laity, and it was that. But it seems to me that the promise of the council has been only partially realized. The laity, that 98% of the church, as Cardinal Newman once wryly remarked, without whom all of this business would look pretty silly, has yet to be fully enfranchised as real co-workers in the vineyard of the Lord, despite the rhetoric of church documents that proclaims them to be so. Which brings me to my third and last point. Why all of this is important to Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry, or the STM, as we call it here. It seems to me that the rules of the game of training ministers for the church have changed rather dramatically since 1964. The older model of seminary formation, that of keeping seminarians sealed off from the world, almost as though the world would corrupt them, has been reshaped so that seminarians are now expected to work in real-world parish settings as part and parcel of their preparation for ordination. The 1960s changed ministerial education for lay people even more dramatically. In 1964, of course, there were little or no ministerial programs aimed at preparing lay people for apostolic life in the church, as all ministry was expected to be undertaken by ordained clergy. The STM is, as all of you know well, the result of combining two fine faculties that existed as separate institutions. The Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry, the IREPM, to all of us here, opened in the summer of 1971 as the Institute of Religious Education and Service. But its population, the people it drew, were mainly priests and women religious. It granted its first degree in 1975. The Weston School of Theology, so called because it was established in the Boston suburb of Weston, Massachusetts, was set up to train Jesuit scholastics for the Catholic priesthood. In 1968, Weston moved into Cambridge, Massachusetts, and became one of the first three Catholic theological schools to be accredited by the Association of Theological Schools, the ATS, by whom we are still accredited. In that same year, Weston opened its doors to lay students for degrees in pastoral ministry and theology. In 2008, just 2 years ago, the Institute and Weston joined forces, along with Church 21 Online, to become the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. In terms of the history of theological education in the United States, we are a young school. I had lunch last week with Bill Graham, who's the dean of the Harvard Divinity School, and I said to him, by Harvard standards, it's 1818, because Harvard Divinity School was established in 1816. And he mentioned to me that we were much further along the road than Harvard was 2 years into it. Indeed, some would say much further along the road. The very fact that the STM goes toe-to-toe with Harvard Divinity School now, just 2 years into our identity in attracting very talented students, is dramatic witness to the strengths which the STM already possesses. But it seems to me that we at the STM must act strategically and with dispatch in positioning the School of Theology and Ministry at the very top of the pack of theological and divinity schools in the United States. And I have 3 reasons for saying this. First, I'm pretty convinced that the Catholic community in the United States today needs lay and ordained ministers and priests who can balance a firm commitment to the Catholic tradition with a well-honed understanding of how to witness to that tradition in a multicultural context in which historical consciousness largely defines how people understand their world. There are some groups in the Church who would have us put the genie back in the bottle and pretend that we can turn the clock back to a purportedly simpler moment, a time in which Catholics understood their faith lives as well as their liturgies as timeless, unchanging realities. My sense is that the Catholic community in the United States needs lay and clerical leaders who are able to talk about and witness to the Catholic tradition through the lens of historical consciousness, precisely in order to make our witness stronger, more robust, and more relevant to the needs of our time and place. As Abraham Lincoln said so well during the time of the Civil War, we cannot escape history. The answers of the past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As believers, we have not been promised to be free of the messy challenges and demands of living in the midst of historical change. We have rather been promised meaning and redemption in the midst of contending with those challenges and demands. And to that extent, what we do at the STM is crucially important, is central to the future of the Catholic community in the United States. Secondly, my sense is that the STM must offer a first-class theological and ministerial education to future leaders in the Catholic community that transcends the political labels that currently hamper discussions in the Church. To recapture older forms of piety and spirituality is not to be conservative or traditional. To utilize the methods of historical criticism for interpreting biblical, liturgical, and theological formulas of the tradition is not to be liberal or progressive. To recapture and utilize these things is simply to be a well-trained minister in a highly complex and demanding cultural context. In a word, the School of Theology and Ministry has to be a nationally and even internationally recognized place where the Church does its best thinking and where ministerial best practice is the template in shaping smart, compassionate, and historically aware priests and ministers who both know and appreciate the glories of the Catholic tradition, but are not shackled to outmoded ways of witnessing to it. I envision a school in which the politically based labels of liberal and conservative, left and right are ultimately found to be irrelevant and are therefore avoided. One of my favorite witnesses to this need for moving beyond metaphors like left and right, conservative and liberal, was Cardinal Avery Dulles, with whom I had breakfast every morning for 20 years. And I recall that actually very, very warmly. In his great book, The Models of the Church, Dulles argued that no single model of the Church could do complete justice to the great mystery at the heart of the Christian gospel. That insight should promote both modesty and mutual respect and understanding among people training for ministry who see things differently. To quote Dulles directly here, and I quote him, "The various models used to illustrate a theological concept should be kept in dialectical tension with each other, so that each one can critique and complement the others. To choose only one model as paradigmatic to the exclusion of others would lead to distortion and to the impoverishment of the overall tradition. To that extent, theological models are neither true nor false, but rather apt or inept." End quote from Dulles. Avery Dulles thus recognized as early as 1974, the year in which Models of the Church was published, that the left-right conservative-liberal labels were basically unhelpful in talking about the Catholic tradition, obscuring more than they illuminated, because all the models were needed to complement and critique each other. I would very much like the STM to be the place within the American Catholic community American Catholic theological community that would be difficult to pigeonhole as left or right. I would much rather that it be known as the place to which talented students interested in lay and ordained ministry in the church come for a thoroughly rigorous education in best thinking and best practice, regardless of their own theological, liturgical, or ecclesiological preferences. One of the best book reviews I ever got, and the only one that I ever framed and put on my wall at Fordham, was a book review of my 1999 monograph called Catholics and American Culture, and the book review opened by saying, "The reader of this monograph will have a difficult time placing Massa on the theological spectrum of liberal or conservative." I love that. My third reason why I believe that the School of Theology and Ministry here at BC can't wait 2 centuries like Harvard to catch up with the very best theological and divinity schools is that the North American Catholic community now finds itself in a difficult situation in terms of passing on its faith and passing on the church to the next generation. The NORC Andy Greeley's shop at Chicago, the National Opinion Research Center, published a study 5 years ago that said that in 1965 there was 1 priest for every 1,900 Catholics. In 2000 there was 1 priest for every 4,000 Catholics. And talking to him a couple weeks ago, his best estimate now is that there's 1 priest for every 5,000 Catholics. These sobering statistics are matched by others, arguably even more sobering. There was a study that came out last year sponsored by the Pew Trust that reported that for every adult convert entering the church, 4 left the church or fell into the fastest growing category in the religious census, a category called nuns, not women with veils, but N-O-N-E-S, people who claimed no religious affiliation. Indeed, if such a denominational category were acceptable as a religious designation, the second largest church in the United States would be called former Catholics, which would rank right after Catholics in terms of the 2 largest groups in the United States. Likewise, Christian Smith in his book Soul Searching, a book I really like. Christian Smith is a sociologist of religion teaching at University of Notre Dame. And his book Soul Searching was based upon interviews of several thousand teenagers in the United States. He argued in that book, there was a special chapter just on Catholic teenagers, and Christian Smith argued that Catholic teenagers made up the single largest group of the real teenage church in the United States, which he calls the Church of Moralistic Therapeutic Deism. And he says that Catholic teenagers are especially inarticulate in talking about their faith, something that I find shocking and probably true from my own experience of teaching the freshman theology course at Fordham, which we always called Dick and Jane Meet God. My experience is that Catholic teenagers, 60% of our teenagers came to us from Catholic schools, and so 60% of them came with 12 years of Catholic education. They were amazingly inarticulate and talking about even basic things about their faith. I think it's not far-fetched to say that the Catholic community has something of a crisis on its hands today. All of this represents an opportunity full of grace for us at the STM, as well as a challenging scenario. The STM brings great gifts to this moment of grace, opportunity, and challenge in American Catholic history. And I say, let the games begin. Thank you.
As Dean Massa has told us, he is willing to entertain some questions. So, Mark, if you will come back up, we have some microphones, one in the back there. I will grab one here and I think hand it to the questioners in the front of the room. If you could do the same for people in the back of the room. Let the games begin.
Dan. This is a tough questioner, Father Dan Harrington. He was my hardest grader at Weston.
In the Catholic dynamic, there's always a sense of both and. Is there any way to retrieve the elements of the classicist mode and combine them with the historicist mode, or are we, in a sense, doomed to let history be one thing after another?
Right, no, exactly. That's a great question. I mean, I love old liturgical forms. I hate it when the church changes prayers. I mean, I hate it, when I go to Mass and there's a new prayer that I have to say in common. I like the old forms. I think the glory of the old forms is that they're hallowed by use, and they really led the faith lives of centuries of believers. So I think Catholics who have a special respect for history and the embodiments of historical evolution in terms of creeds and liturgies and prayers, I think we have a special obligation to hold on to those things, maybe infuse them with new meaning when we say them. But no, I would hate to think that we're simply becoming what Henry Ford described history as one damn thing after another. No, I don't think that's a useful way of thinking, but I think there's a way that we have to take and revere those older forms and approach them with a new set of eyes to understand what they're talking about. Pretty much what the people in your field do best. I would say Bible scholars are the most ahead of this of any group. I mean, we're not going to drop, like Thomas Jefferson, we're not going to clip out the miraculous parts of the Bible and just piece together a Bible that looks like the Velveteen Rabbit, but rather, that we rather read the Bible through the lens of a historical consciousness and actually have a deeper understanding of what it says. So not you get rid of the Bible, or rather you approach it with a new set of eyes. And I think that's what I'm calling for, sort of a balancing of that. Reverence for the tradition, but understanding that the tradition has to be understood in a new way. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Great. Yeah. Jim Keenan.
Thank you, Mark. A question about, do Americans themselves have an interest in history? And that was in your talk, but you didn't really develop it. I'm just thinking here at BC, there's yourself, there's Jim O'Toole, there's Steve Schlesser, there's Steve Brown. There's quite a number of people who are doing research about the nature of faith and church communities. They're doing all this historical investigation. That's not to say it's not happening in the other continents.
Right.
But there's something specific about the American interest in history in terms of their faith lives?
Americans, I'm just going to make a big blanket cultural statement, and I'll put an asterisk and say, excused by the following exceptions. Americans are bad at history. Americans don't know their own past, and I found this a lot with my undergraduates, and I tell undergraduates at Fordham that you get a kid who sort of comes in all excited and said, Father Massa, I found this brand new thing, it's called the Rosary. Have you heard about it? And you go, yeah, I've heard about it. It's like, it's been around. So I think that there is a lack of understanding and an appreciation of the ancient nature of the tradition, of the Catholic tradition. And I think that's maybe especially obvious among the young, but it's more than the young. I was to say that for undergraduates, a tradition is older than anything older than 7 minutes. It's the time between commercials on MTV. So it's like, we've always done it this way, which means we've been doing it for 7 minutes. I think part of the problem is that when you're learning the tradition, when you're passing on the tradition, part and parcel has to be that handing on the appreciation of how the thing evolved and why we reverence the past and why we incorporate these various parts of the past in our liturgy and our prayers and in the structure of the church. Not being bound by them exactly, but saying, these are important. This is where we come from. You have to know about this. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. BC has a great interest in history, and I think we're privileged to have a lot of scholars who take the study of the religious past seriously, revered scholars who do that. I would like to make those riches more widely available and encourage more students to do that. I think that there is a tendency, not so much here, but there is a tendency to study theology as though it's timeless. I think it's absolutely crucial to understand what St. Augustine and St. Thomas. I would be appalled if any graduate of the STM left and hadn't read St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. That doesn't answer all of our questions, but you have to start there. So, yes, I think there has to be a historical component in all of this. Meg?
When you spoke about the laity in the church, the question that I have is, with the rapid growth of ecclesial movements and new communities that have occurred dramatically since the papacy of John Paul II, and their significant power and influence financially, theologically, culturally, I just wonder if you could say a little bit about the way in which their power and influence kind of goes contrary, maybe, to what you were saying about the role of the laity in the church.
It's a good question. I have a question about how deeply and broadly that influence is. I think there are pockets of great strength of those lay ecclesial movements. The numbers I have seen, I'm an inveterate reader of the NORC and the Carroll website. There are two big websites you can go to get data, and I read them every day. One's at Georgetown called the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, CARA, and the other one is the NORC, University of Chicago one, National Opinion Research Center. They would imply that while those are for the people who belong to them, they're very important parts of their lives, they touch a relatively small percentage of lay people, actually, I would say. It's like religious orders. I mean, yes, religious orders are having incredible influence on the church. We're talking about 1 or 2% of Catholics, you know. I mean, so in the United States, at least, I think there are these pockets of very vibrant lay movements. I'm not sure how broad they are. And my sense is that there are certain places where they're quite deep and strong, but in most parishes in the United States, if I stood out, I'll make a bet with you. I'll make you bet with you for $5, which is a lot of money for me. If I stood outside of a parish in Boston, not St. Ignatius Loyola, but say went to a parish someplace, and stood outside on the front door and said, "Have you heard of any of these groups?" My bet would be that the great majority of people would say no. So, would you want that bet? What do you think? No? We'll talk about it. Okay.
One more in the front here, and then we'll go to the back.
Recently, I heard a comment by the Croatian-American theologian Miroslav Volf. He said that in academia today, they have given up on the question, what is the meaning of life? And if this is the case, we have so many Catholic students attending these universities. My question would be, how do you see the Catholic intellectual tradition surviving in such an atmosphere?
I'm delighted you asked that question because actually BC just put together a really, really smart thing called the Catholic intellectual tradition. And they pass it out to everyone. I don't know if it's out there. Certainly, it's kind of hard to go into a building and not run into it. I think that's a concern for a lot of people at places like this about how we pass this on and make that conscious in people and students' minds and how we pass it on to them. I think BC is pretty far down that road in terms of addressing this in some sort of organized way. Not that everybody goes home to their dormitory room and debates it with their roommates. That would be great if they did. I don't think it does. But I think we have to start somewhere. So I think on multi-levels, I'm the dean of a place. As I say to the provost of Boston College, I'm the dean of the easily loved. I mean, I'm the dean of a school whose students are focused, generous, want to give their lives to the church, want to do ministry. I don't know, Andy, do you think that's the... just like the school of the Carroll School of Management, yeah. Andy said, just like our school. I don't think so. So, I mean, I think my sense is that I will begin by saying I live a fairly privileged life because I live in a school where this is the number one thing we debate every day and talk about every day, and we worship together every week and things like that. I think BC, I mean, I can't speak for the other 236, how many Catholics? 235, 236 Catholic schools. But at Fordham at BC, my sense is that we worked hard at starting that conversation. I think you may be right. But I think there's a lot of people worried about it and want to address it. So I'm not sure if that's the answer completely that you want. But I think it's not something not on people's screens. It's something very much on people's screens and something we worry about and talk about all the time. So. I'm sorry, I'm at the mercy of...
A couple years ago, the Church in the 21st Century sponsored a talk here by Archbishop Michael Miller, who is from the Pontifical Council of Education. I guess he's in Canada now. But he made a case for the southern hemisphere and the northern. The rich are getting richer in the north, the poor are getting poorer in the south, in Catholic education.
Right.
And he was looking for a way to, for the North sharing the resources. Now, it seems to me that same argument can be made within the United States. In the Catholic school system, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Where the tuition's going so high that we're not reaching the poor. Now, is there any way we can bring in this liberation theology idea? John Sobrino, a Jesuit, says that there's no salvation outside of the poor, one of his phrases. And Ignatius of Loyola, he had no tuition fees for
the poor ones, anyway. Yeah, he soaked the rich, as I remember. So it's like, I defer to the dean of the Lynn School of Education, Father Joe O'Keefe here. Joe, do you have any ideas on this?
Yeah, it's an enormous problem that the church is facing, that the archdiocese is facing. I think part of the issue.
Why don't you come up here?
I think we need to find new structures. I think a lot of the traditional parish structures no longer work. I think we have to engage people who not only are donors, but people who are engaged in the leadership and development of schools. The system and the model is broken. And I think that the recognition of that at this point, diocese after diocese, the engagement of Catholic universities in this, I'm not disagreeing at all with what you say, but I think the awareness of the problem that you describe is being recognized much more than it has in the past. It's a question of, I mean, in many ways we've experienced a perfect storm with the economic downturn, with the increasing challenge of competition in the education sector. I could go on, and I won't. But my point is, I think it's valid, it's important, and a lot is being done to try to rectify it.
See how well the dean of the STM delegates to others. Another question. There's someone here who has his hand up for a while.
In the American experience, it seems to me that the great sea change was the GI Bill.
Right. 1945,
right. And as a result of the GI Bill, those of us who were in that age and followed afterwards came to recognize that the church emphasized accidentals more than essentials, and rules rather than gospel values. And here we are today, and I'd ask the bishops who are now going in conference this month, are you thinking what I'm thinking, or do you care what I'm thinking? Where's the engagement?
Is that your question to me or to the bishops?
It's to the church.
Well, I think that's a good question. For those of you who don't know, the GI Bill in 1945 was a bill passed by Congress that said that any servicemen who fought in the war could go to college and have their tuition paid by the government. And there was a famous article, an essay in America Magazine called "Can Catholic Lambs Eat Ivy?" It was about this whole idea that before then, Catholic students just went automatically to Catholic schools. In fact, for most Jesuit schools wouldn't even forward your transcript to non-Catholic schools. So, you know, we would just automatically, and that changed. The GI Bill changed lots of things, but that's one of the things that changed. I'm not sure I would put 1945 as the date by which Catholics started emphasizing accidentals and not essentials. I think that's that's a big problem.
That's the opposite. That the tradition had been accidentals.
Okay.
Now, educated Catholics are saying, what are the essentials?
Right.
You ask me to follow rules, but do the rules recognize gospel values?
Well, I think that I think the problem here is, of course, that lots of immigration historians always predict that as a group moves out of what's called the first areas of settlement, there's a shakedown. Religious groups move out of their first area of settlement to the second and third area. Third areas of settlement traditionally are like suburbs and things like that. that there's a shakedown in religious identity, and what happens is that what's discovered is a lot of the people who were Jewish or Baptist or Catholic or whatever, because they lived in this first area, were no longer such. When they were confronted with the question of, now that you can be anything or nothing, do you still want to hold on to this? And I think most immigration historians and ethnographers would say, in every group there's a shakedown. That's my sense. I think the Catholic Church, when it moved out of its first area of settlement, probably after World War II, somewhere between World War I and World War II, the GI Bill certainly caused that to speed up dramatically. I think there was a fall-off of practice, and I think what happened is that a lot of Catholics moving out to other areas of settlement suddenly discovered, well, this is not important to me anymore. That in the days when I could follow the rules and show up in Mass on Sunday, it's the does it count? I love the does it count question. Like when priests do a Mass at 4 o'clock on Saturdays, when you do a wedding at 4 o'clock, somebody comes up and says, "Does this count?" I can't answer you. But I think people who had that "does this count" kind of approach to things discovered when they moved out of the first areas of settlement that for them it probably didn't. And I think that's unfortunate. That's something that people who worry about Catholic identity have to take into account. But if the ethnographers are correct, and I think they are, we're not unique. The same thing happened to the Jewish community, the same thing's happened to the Protestant communities, and the same thing is going on in the Catholic Church today. It doesn't mean we can't be creative in addressing that problem. Am I answering?
Well, you did, but the emphasis prior to Vatican II was from the pulpit selling fear rather than selling benefits. And we have to move to sell benefits.
Amen. I agree. I think there's a young man in this room.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the apt, inapt designation that Avery Dulles uses, because very often in my limited experience in religious life, it's a zero-sum game, and that there needs to be winners and losers on the liberal or conservative side. Mm-hmm. Do you see a roadmap out of that morass and actual dialogue?
I think Avery was right on. Avery argued in his book, it's in his introduction to the book Models of the Church, if you want to go, if you don't own it, you should go out and buy it today, But what he argues is that theological models are true to the extent that they help us uncover something true about the original insight, the revelation of the gospel. And therefore, all the models tell us something. Some of them are better and some of them are worse on the scale. But all the models tell us something, and therefore, rather than going in and saying which one is right and which one is wrong, say, well, which one reveals the most light on this, and which ones hide the most things, and how can we balance these things? Karen Armstrong, who I am a fan of, actually, she just wrote a book called The Case for God. It came out last year. And Karen Armstrong makes the same point in arguing about religious tradition. She talks about the God killers, people like Christopher Hitchens, and others who construct a straw God and then demolish them. And she says, the problem with these, she says there's a lot of talk about God these days, and most of it is inept. It's not untrue, it's just inept. It constructs a false model and then destroys it. So I think both Avery and Karen Armstrong are right on that maybe a better way, a roadmap out of that morass of the left-right thing is saying, well, I think conservatives or traditionalists are right, that we have this great tradition of piety and liturgy that we have to take seriously, and we have to recover it, and we have to pass on, and the liberals and the progressives are right, that historical consciousness is here and we have to deal with it. Well, what models can we construct to make the most sense of the tradition then, using both of those insights? And some of them will be more apt than others, but there are certain things that are wrong. I'm not afraid of telling my undergraduates, no, you're wrong on that answer. That's not true. But I think on the level of serious theology, it's better to think of that sort of spectrum of apt to inept and figure out where it is. And I think rather than start to label people as this or that, this person disagrees with me, so they must be this. Well, Avery, I once told Avery, I said, now, there's much play being given Avery about your conversion from being a liberal to conservative. And he laughed and said, that's a fruitful rumor. It's not true, but you can spread it. I think he didn't have much time for those kind of labels. I mean, he was a very smart theologian. He said, I don't pay much attention to that kind of thing. He said, I haven't changed very much in 40 years. So,
One more, Mark?
yeah.
I think one of the reasons the church is in crisis these days that most people realize is that young people, women and men alike, have a great deal of trouble with an institution where women are second-class citizens within their own beloved church. And one friend said, why is it that people who are products of Catholic education, seminarians, people who have gone through Catholic high schools and grade schools, Catholic universities, internalize the idea that the church is all about Jesus and the 12? And so could you speak a little bit about, in terms of developing more of a historical consciousness of the role of women throughout church history, what the STM can do to contribute to this?
Well, I think the STM is wonderful because we have very strong and really good women scholars and teachers. I think it's almost impossible to go to the STM and not to witness good women in apostolic positions. I think that's, I think we got that sort of part of it right, basically. And I think I'm not in any way implying that that's true of the American church. I know what you're saying, and I know what you're implying about the rest of it. But my sense is there's all kinds of ways we can be creative of imaging and modeling women in positions of authority and power that are true to the tradition, that are true to the biblical tradition and the historical tradition, that brings in those gifts. I mean, one of the things that makes me most heartbroken is that when I was in New York, I used to go out to a very wealthy parish on the North Shore of Long Island. It had 4,000 families, St. Patrick's in Huntington. It was a very, very smart, well-educated, affluent congregation, and there were all kind of very smart men and women who were CEOs and bankers. And you think, here we are, the priest is still doing the books. Like, there are people on Wall Street, these people, we should farm this out. Other people who know this better than we should be doing this. And I think in terms of best practice, there are lots of dioceses where that's happening. I think the thing is to make it more uniform and get it throughout the church. I think that's the task. It's not that that's not already happening in some places. But I think we have to make it more uniform, and also in our educational institutions, like the STM, I think we have to model it and just say, this is, we need to make sure that everyone training for ministry, both clerical and lay, are exposed to really smart, really talented, really confident men and women who know what they're doing. I don't know if I'm answering your question. One more? Just one more?
One more?
There's a young man over here.
One more.
Okay.
What do you think of or see as the place, if any, of non-Catholic students at the STM?
Well, I think that the general of I'm a Jesuit, and the general of the society said in our day to be religious is to be interreligious, and I would say it's also to be interdenominational. I think we're training for the most religiously pluralistic culture on earth in the United States. So I think part and parcel of what we have to do is training people for ministry, is teaching people to see the gifts and the insights of other traditions, and how that can help them minister to their own tradition. So not that everything's equal, it's like an uncritical relativism. All the religions are equal, and Catholicism is the most equal of all. I mean, it's not that kind of thing, but it's rather that, in fact, there are real insights and wisdom that we have to learn. And I think that's intrinsic to, and I was just talking about this at a meeting that Jim Keenan helped to set up with the chair of theology, and I said, I'd like to move toward a time when all the MDiv students will be required to take a course in another religious tradition, just to give them a sense that these are these ancient, revered traditions out there that speak wisdom, and we should know about them. Thank you. You've been a great audience.
Thank you.